Podcasting, the final frontier. These are the episodes of a Catch as Catch Can podcast. Its continuing mission to explore strange, nerdy topics, to chat about sports, movies, TV, sci-fi, and so much more. To boldly pod where this nerd has gone before.
Greetings and felicitations, everybody. My name is Daniel Floyd, and welcome to Boldly Pod, the Catch as Catch Can podcast. What does that mean? Well, that means we can talk about just about anything and everything here on this quaint little podcast. And if you notice, the last couple episodes, we talked about the TV show Picard with my friend Aaron. And this episode, I'm joined by my buddy Dave, and we're going to talk about something that's very near and dear to not only him and I, but near and dear to millions of other people as well. We're going to talk about professional wrestling. But more specifically, it kind of occurred to me that professional wrestling really exploded into the mainstream in the 1980s. So there's nobody that I know better for me to sit down and chat wrestling with than Dave. So here's Dave and I's little conversation about 80s wrestling. And we kind of get sidetracked, but that's what we tend to do. All right, throw your bit at me.
Is that your TV?
No, not my TV.
Okay. I'm just getting the money's worth out now that's streaming. So, how you doing, my friend?
I'm hanging in there. How you doing?
I'm hanging in there, too. Over 2 months of quarantine with 6 kids.
Hey, whose fault is that? I mean, it could be worse. You could be quarantined with, like, Christy and Taylor and mix in anyone else. Barnett.
Oh.
You've been quarantined with Christy, so.
No.
So.
No.
We're going to discuss what is the heyday, or what became the heyday, when professional wrestling hit the mainstream, and that would be the 1980s. Am I correct in that, or am I wrong?
Oh. Did you... 1980s wrestlers?
Yeah.
I'm going to be totally honest with you. I misread your post. I thought you said wrestlers in their 80s. I'm going to have to come with a whole new... You're going to have to call me back or something. Because I got Bill Watts and Dory Jr. almost made the cut, but it was a tough list to... Okay. Yes, we will talk about 80s wrestlers.
Well, you didn't mention Vern for wrestlers in their 80s.
Well, yeah, Vern was close to 80 when he was still putting himself over with his belt. So,
I said, am I correct in the fact that I think that wrestling really hit the mainstream in the 1980s?
Yeah, I think so. It was kind of perfect timing, I think. Vince gets the credit and the evil eye for, going national or something, but I've said it before. Somebody was going to do it with cable, with cable come up and coming. Somebody was going to do it, and Tully's dad, Joe Blanchard, he was actually trying to do it. If he was on USA before Vince was in 1983, So, and Ole had the Superstation, had TBS. So I don't, as much as Ole crapped on Vince for going national, I think they would have done it down there in TBS sooner or later. So it was just kind of the perfect storm. They caught a break because Stallone was a wrestling fan, still is a wrestling fan, and he had Terry Funk in a couple of his movies in the 70s and whatnot. So I can't remember the exact story, but I think it was actually Terry Funk was at least one of the ones that put Stallone in touch with Hogan, or Hogan in touch with Stallone, whichever way it went, for the Rocky movie, and it just kind of all exploded.
Now, before we get into the actual wrestlers of the 80s, one other thing that just popped into my head. Do you think the WWF explosion, how much did the rock and wrestling angle that Vince crossed with helped with the explosion?
Okay, MTV, they were still showing videos for all the youngsters listening in on us. MTV used to play music videos.
Well, the youngsters want to know what a video is.
Yeah, that's true. Was it Captain Lou and Cyndi Lauper? Lauper was a big wrestling fan, being there from New York City and whatnot. And she met Captain Lou, and next thing you knew, WWF was on MTV. And they were expanding nationally, and they had this other audience on MTV. So, then I think it was a CBS cartoon, if my memory serves me correctly. I think you're right. I think it was a CBS. But it was just a major explosion. I don't know if it was all at once, but it was kind of a perfect storm.
So we'll grant Hogan as the mega star. Who else do you think was instrumental in the 80s to make wrestling what it was?
Okay, this is what I'm gonna. We were talking about 5, and I kind of came up with a list of 6 right off the top of my head. Then there's a few other here and there that I'm going to throw in afterwards, just for different reasons. Okay, this and I don't know if this is in any particular order, but I still have Andre in the 80s. Some people would say he was bigger in the 70s, but he was still a major player in the 80s, and he helped build up to what turned into WrestleMania 3. That really, if Hogan wasn't over by WrestleMania 3 put Hogan completely over, and it kind of took Andre to do that.
Right.
So, and up until Andre became WWF exclusive, he was still a major draw in the territories all the way up until late '83, before he became exclusive to WWF. And but then he was still going to Japan but he'd been going to Japan for all those years for Baba, but once he became kind of WWF exclusive, Inoki's relationship with Vince, Andre kind of moved to Inoki. So I kind of still have to put Andre there. And the problem with that is my first 3 are kind of set in stone. Okay. then I have a fourth who could be in the top three. And when I put Andre at number 5, it bumps out this other guy who probably should be at number 5, and that's Macho Man.
Right.
It's a real tough call for me not to put Macho in the top 5, but I kind of bumped him out, and you'll see why when we get to the next person. But I would still say Macho Man was very, very important in the 80s.
Well, I thought you were going to say Uncle Elmer was the one that got bumped.
Well, now that he's up at 1 and 2.
All right, so let me
don't ruin my list.
So let me see if I can guess your top 3. You have Flair, Hogan, and Piper.
Yes. And at number 4, because it is not just because I didn't want to do WWF exclusively. I still wanted to hit the NWA. And even though this is a WWF thing, I included, because Dusty was over like Rover.
Right.
All the way up until I want to say at least 88. Maybe he got a little tired by late 87-ish. But, all through the 80s, he was over. And they would, whether it would be Harley, bring him into town, to see if Dusty would, win the belt. And Dusty was even, and this is not, no, see, that would have been back when, but, that's, I'm kind of going back to the 70s, but even Vince Sr. would bring Dusty in to New York to wrestle Superstar Graham.
I remember that, yeah.
In 77 and 78. And this Southern boy who was big in Texas and Florida and the Carolinas and everything, you put him in Madison Square Garden, and they were flocking to him up there too. They loved him up there. So I gotta say Dusty was one of the biggest stars in the 80s.
So speaking of Dusty, maybe you can, how much did he like the Virgil kind of jab at him with Virgil? Did he laugh about it or did he hate it?
My understanding was he thought it was funny.
Right.
Yeah, he got a crack at it. Because he had, like I just mentioned, he had a good relationship with Vince Sr. And even though at the time there was this NWA versus WWE, he knew what was going on. He knew the writing was kind of on the wall, and he kind of went at it in a different way, but he was trying to bring in, I won't say Hollywood, but he was trying to bring in stars to the Crockett stuff. But it might have been NASCAR drivers or country, a different flavor. But he was trying to do the, whatever you want to call it, the commercial bit part of it too.
Right.
And he had some success, but Vince had the New York machine behind him.
Right. So who else is on your list then? I don't want to ruin your list. I already spoiled it with Uncle Elmer. So
what am I at? Big Dust? I'm at Dusty.
Yeah, you had.
All right. And I already mentioned Andre and Macho, kind of Space Mountain. Flair was in the 80s. I think Flair was as over and popular as somebody could be in the wrestling business without having the WWF machine behind them, if that makes sense.
Totally.
I think he was, you know, for never having that, you know, that working with him up until 91, people who were not wrestling fans would still know who Ric Flair was, you know, and he was just part of this, you know, smaller Southern wrestling thing, but they still knew who Nature Boy was, even in the 80s. You know, and his popularity has actually grown present day because of other, you know, other things, but people still knew who he was.
Oh, absolutely.
And he was very important in wrestling.
I mean, I freely admit I was a WWF guy, and I knew who he was. So,
well, see, I was an NWA guy who tuned into WWF. You know, I found NWA first. Then all of a sudden one Saturday, WWF was on, and with the Rocky guy that I knew from the magazines and whatnot. But I'm like, what's going on here? So.
And you got to see the 60-second jobber match.
Right, you know, it was a totally different. You know, this is kind of cliche, but it was a totally different style of wrestling between the two of them. You know, you wouldn't. You watch NWA and you would have a 60-minute match with Magnum and Tully or Dusty and Flair.
Right.
You know, if you got more than an 8-minute match with Hogan, 6 of it was posing. So, you know.
And none of it was selling.
Yeah, totally different. Both good for what they needed to be, but just totally different. I kind of mentioned this to you before. You know, I think I first found Georgia Championship Wrestling about '82, so I would have been about 9 years old, and I don't know the exact moment or anything when I started to question exactly what it was, you know, like, wait a minute, I'm seeing stuff, I'm like, wait, but still, I up until I fully knew what wrestling was, I would watch NWA and believe 100% of it, and I don't know my exact terminology that I was using in my own 11, 12-year-old mind, but I would turn on WWF and I would be like, oh, they're kind of pretending half the time.
Right.
You know, yeah, I can see they're kind of pretending, but NWA, 100%. Yeah, this is the real stuff right here.
So you have Flair, you have Dusty, you have Andre. And who's next? Hogan?
Well, I think it's kind of, you know, it's kind of not even a question who, in my opinion, who the biggest star of the 80s was, besides Uncle Elmer. Brother. So
it's Rotundo and Wyndham.
Yes, Rotundo and Wyndham. the U.S. Express. The Hulkster, Hulkamania, you know, even Flair, you know, Flair says that there's no question that Hogan was the biggest star of the 80s. No, you know, he doesn't like debate who best wrestler was, but there's no question even in Flair's mind who the biggest star was.
Well, I think we've all agreed a lot of times the biggest star is far from being the best wrestler.
Oh yeah. But yeah, and the best wrestler, a lot of the times, especially in the old days, couldn't talk at all, so they just kind of didn't do anything with them. They put them on to work a good match and whatnot, but they wouldn't hype them at all because they couldn't talk. And it's back when you had managers. Typically speaking, if you were a bad guy and didn't talk, then you could get a manager to talk for you. But the good guys generally didn't have managers for what,
Right.
Because the managers are supposed to be doing bad things, cheating, so you can't really have a good guy manager out there cheating.
So here's
Which brings up. I'm skipping just a little bit to the '90s, even though this is not. Let me ask you a question. This is WWF logic. I don't know if you ever thought about this, but one of the best big men in the history. He might have been gimmicky, but athletically, Big Boss Man. He was a face, good guy in the '90s.
right.
He turned right, whatnot. So they do a program, and they bring in a convict called Nails. Okay, and the storyline is Big Boss Man was beaten on him while in prison. Now, you got a crooked corrections officer beating on a prisoner? How the hell does the prisoner become the bad guy in this, and the corrections officer is still the face?
Because anyone with the name Nails is the bad guy.
You can't fault him for what his mom named him.
Yeah, but it was Nails with a Z.
Oh.
Makes all the difference in the world.
I just don't understand how the boss man is the good guy in that situation. But
because back then Vince could sell you anything. Look what he did with forgetting the champ before Hogan.
Backlund?
Yeah, Backlund, when he brought him back in the 90s and did that whole running for president, I'm a nutbag. He was, part of the time he was a face.
Yeah. That goes back when they put the belt, when Hogan beat Sheik and Hogan first had the belt. Vince wanted Backlund to turn heel right away in '84.
Right.
And Backlund turned him down. He didn't see the money in it. 10 years later, he comes back as the bad guy, and actually, they actually do some business with it. But he didn't see the money, and he had young kids, and he didn't want his young kids to think that he had turned into a bad guy. So he turned it down.
Well, I was thinking about what you said about the Boss Man, and that was kind of the 90s is where they really blurred the edge of good guy, bad guy wrestlers with Austin and even HBK, and I think maybe it was a sign of society.
Yeah, I think definitely started getting blurred. I think maybe ECW had a little bit to do with that.
Absolutely.
The whole attitude thing. I think to jump back a little bit, I think Jake the Snake in the late 80s and early 90s, when he was a good guy, he was still kind of dark or whatever, mysterious or whatever.
Right.
So there was kind of a blurring, back with Jake, I think, maybe. Also. Because he first, I'm trying to remember when he first turned to good guy, what the storyline was. I know he had that program with Andre, and
it was
the whole thing was Bobby, don't say snake, because Andre was scared of snakes and whatnot.
89, 90, it wasn't that when he wrestled Martel?
Yes. In the blindfold match, Martel blinded him,
right,
with the perfume and whatnot. Then Earthquake squashed the snake while still in the bag. Then later on that week, they tricked Bobby and Jake tricked Vince into eating hamburgers, but were not really hamburgers. They were evidently snake burgers. I actually just stumbled across that clip a couple weeks ago. He was making snake burgers.
So you got 4 of your wrestlers. Who's the fifth one?
You know what? I think I skipped over. Did I skip over Piper?
Well, we just kind of passively mentioned him.
Yeah, I kind of. But see, my 3 are kind of always set in stone: Hogan, Flair, and Piper.
Right.
And Piper was, we kind of mess around about it, but he was another one, kind of like Hogan, maybe to a lesser degree, of course, but he was able to cross over the movies and other things. And he was, another one. You didn't necessarily have to be a wrestling fan to know who Roddy Piper was in the 80s. He was on MTV. He was in movies.
Yeah, everyone knows him from They Live now, and the aborted pilot that him and Jesse did.
I've heard this. I've heard this story over the years. Him, Jesse, and Terry Funk are the 3 that I hear about the most, that took advantage of it in smart business, as far as I'm concerned. But Terry Funk did some movies. Jesse, of course, did some movies. And Funk wasn't starring in any movies, but he was in the background in some movies. Piper had some starring roles. And what it was is they became part of the Actors Guild of the union when they did this, and they made sure they paid their dues every year in order to get the health insurance through the union. For all Terry Funk hasn't. He hasn't been in a movie since Over the Top in 1987 or 88 or whatever, but he made sure he paid his union dues every year, and he got the medical insurance. So when he needed needed his 5 new hips and his 7 new knees, he had, and that's one way. Because we all know the stories that they don't have medical insurance. But some of these guys figured out ways more than 35 years ago to get their insurance. And Piper, Jesse, and Terry Funk are the big three that I always hear about. That took it, that I don't even want to say work the system, because I don't think they worked the system. They paid and got what was coming to them, I guess. To me, it's business.
Well, they did what they had to do.
Mm-hmm.
I just listened to one of the episodes of 83 Weeks with Bischoff, where he was talking about Piper when he signed with WCW in the 90s. And one of the things that was the selling point for Piper was TNT and TBS, and also Turner owning New Line Cinemas, and that was part of the reason that he signed WCW, so he could branch out there.
That makes a lot of sense. And even to go back to kind of what I was talking about, when Bobby and like Mean Gene left and went to WCW, they were offered more money than what Vince was able to offer at the time. But I've heard Bobby, before they passed away, Bobby and Gene both say the main reason that they went is because they were going to work for, Turner, a company, because WWF was still a family business.
Right.
A huge family business, but they were still a family business. But the selling point of going to WCW was they were getting insurance there, because they had a Turner contract, which later, I guess, I can't remember the time, AOL contract or whatever, but
right.
You can't know what I'm saying. They were, actual employees, to where all those years at WWF, they were probably,
contract labor.
1090, they were 1099 workers, filling out their own expense reports and stuff. So,
is there anyone else on your list from the 80s that we've missed?
Okay, this is one guy. And I'm not saying, and I'm not saying he's Hogan, Flair, Piper, Dusty, Macho, or Andre, or anything like that. But I'm going to include, or not include him, but I'm just going to mention him, and it's Bruiser Brody. And the reason being is he was huge in Japan, and he was huge in every territory that they brought him into here in the United States.
Right.
He and he didn't stay long in any territory, but when they brought him in, it was to sell out an arena, and he did. Whether it was up in Minnesota or down in Georgia or in Texas or wherever, they brought him in Memphis. They brought him in, sold the place out, and he went to the next place. And he was over. He never got the mainstream. The other guys that we're talking about never got the mainstream exposure. But in the wrestling circles, he was over in all the magazines. Promoters didn't necessarily always like dealing with him, because he was kind of what they hated. He was a businessman, and he didn't, if he came in for a show, and he was told that, oh, you're going to get $2,500 for the show or whatever, and he'd peek out behind the curtain and see a sold out arena. He's in town to face Harley, or in Memphis to face Jerry. This place is packed. I think you're going to have to bump that up to about 4,000 or 5,000.
Well,
And promoters didn't really have a choice in it.
Right.
Because, he'd just walk out. So.
Well, you mentioned another one that I just thought of. Letterman aside, what about Lawler in the 80s?
Jerry is on Jerry's right, and he's not. And it's not that he's below Brody. He's also on my almost list, and that's the King, because he was huge in Memphis all through the 80s, and Memphis. We joke about it, but Memphis was a booming company.
Right.
All through the 80s. And he was on Letterman. He slapped Kaufman, the whole shebang. And for Lawler just to be this, in this small time compared to other things, in Tennessee, Lawler had mainstream exposure as well.
That should be something we should do some other time, is take some of the smaller, like Lawler, and play the what if game. What would happen if he would have been in the WWE in the heyday?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Well, and this thing almost happened. You talk about two guys who are talkers, right? They had a program that they were getting ready to start, and Lawler made a couple appearances, and Ole was going to bring in Lawler, and him and Piper were going to have a program against each other.
Oh, wow.
And it got nixed somehow. I think it was because Jerry Jarrett, this would have been about 83-ish or whatnot, and Jarrett was kind of having a war with the NWA about not getting the champion in Memphis enough. So he started doing business with Vern and started bringing in Bockwinkel, started bringing in Nick to Memphis to fight Lawler, because he couldn't get the NWA champion to come in enough, even though they were booming. But yeah, they sent Lawler down to TBS, and somewhere on YouTube, there's evidence of it. He's up there and he's talking about Piper and whatnot. This is right before Piper headed up north too. But there was going to be a program way back when with Lawler and Piper, and it got nixed. And I think that would have been, you talk about two guys who could talk, talk up a storm. And I think Lawler would have been the bad guy, because he would have been coming into the territory.
Right. That would have been cool.
Well, okay, I'm losing my train of thought, but talking about blurring the line, Roddy Piper, even before Jake, even when he was a full-fledged good guy, he still cheated.
Oh, absolutely.
Still guys, still kick people in between the legs, still use the ropes, even when he was a good guy.
Poke the eyes.
So yeah, I had Lawler kind of, on I don't know if it's an honorable mention list or not. I had a couple other guys. I know he kind of became really gimmicky and cartoonish, but before he put on weight and kind of got lazy, because he put on about 50 pounds. But Junkyard Dog,
right?
Up until about 87, 88, especially down in the South. Now, nobody take offense to this. It was a different time and different world. But kind of in my mind, Junkyard Dog, when he was in the NWA and then Mid-South for Bill Watts, he was kind of maybe the unofficial black world champion.
Right.
Kind of like what Bobo and Ernie Ladd were in the 60s and 70s. But Junkyard Dog in the South, he was kind of like the unofficial, and no one take offense, it was just a different time.
Right.
You know, they, I won't even say right or wrong because, you know, it was wrong, but they weren't going to actually put a, you know, the big belt on an African American at the time.
Nope.
But he was still, you know, kind of seen on, you know, on par with the top stars. And you know, the WWF version of them is kind of a joke, but in the early 80s to the mid 80s, in the NWA and the Mid South, it was kind of Junkyard Dog is the good guy and Butch Reed as the bad guy.
Right.
Kind of as the fighting each other as kind of, like I said, the unofficial black world champion of wrestling. You know, and Bobo and Ernie Ladd, different time, kind of had that program going in the 60s and 70s. Bobo, the good guy, and Ladd, you know, mostly as a bad guy.
And I thought you were going to say Mil Mascaras.
Well, just okay. Things you can't. Never mind.
You just want to see that surfboard.
Just a couple more. Just to throw their names out there is Sergeant Slaughter, big in the 80s, G.I. Joe. You know,
right.
He had mainstream success.
Reinvented himself in the early 90s to sell the whole Desert Storm.
Yep. And another guy that they just did a Dark Side of the Ring at was Jimmy Snuka in the early to mid 80s was a mega star before he probably killed his girlfriend.
Right.
And he kind of got buried for, you know, probably good reasons. After that, it was kind of never the same. But Snuka was big, you know, and they, you know, the old, it was Foley, and I think Tommy Dreamer was in the audience at the time too. A couple other wrestlers were in the audience. I know Foley for sure, maybe Dreamer when Snuka came off the top cage onto Morocco and blah blah blah.
I remember reading that in Foley's book about how he drove through a snowstorm or something just to get there.
Yeah. And again, for all the youngsters out there, back in 1982 and 83, people didn't come off the top of the cage. You know, every match. You know, they didn't kick out at 1.5 after you know, going through a table. You know, just to kind of put everything in perspective. Then I have just one more, and the reason, because I think he was probably more 70s, but I didn't want to totally leave out the AWA completely, so I put Nick Bockwinkel down because he was still kind of the you know, he was the champion in most of the 70s. Him and Vern, you know, and Vern finally went away, but Nick was kind of seen as the head guy on AWA, I think.
Right.
You know, the elder statesman or whatever. When they got themselves on ESPN, you know, again, I'm not in no way am I saying he was Hogan, Flair, people outside of wrestling, probably wouldn't know who Nick Bockwinkel was, the whole shop. But I don't know. I might be totally incorrect about that, but he was the one AWA guy that I could think of for the 80s. And I might be wrong, but...
No, I think you're right, because he kind of groomed, say, Perfect and Scott Hall and all those guys that Vince cherry-picked in the late 80s.
And it might not have been the NWA, and it might not have been the WWF, the popularity-wise, but he was a world champion at 50 years of age. And again, boys and girls, 50 years of age 30 years ago, 35, 40 years ago was totally different than 50 years old now.
I think absolutely.
Totally. And Bockwinkel didn't live a hard life, I don't think, but just trust me, the people that you see on your TV on old shows, if you do watch it, that 55-year-old guy, spoiler alert, he's probably only 30. If the show is from 1976. Harder living.
So you wanted me here at the end to remind you that we're talking about the heyday of wrestling in the 80s.
No, I think the show went pretty good, especially, like I said, at the beginning of the major flop of me thinking this was wrestlers in their 80s. I think we recovered pretty good.
Well, you talked about Bockwinkel.
Well, I appreciate you having me on my show again.
Hey, always is. You're always welcome back there. What was your name again?
Who's this?
Exactly. All right, thanks, Dave.
Who's this again?
I'll talk to you later. And that's going to wrap up another edition of Too Boldly Pod. Thank you very much to my buddy Dave for joining me. If you have any thoughts about the topics discussed on today's podcast, let me know on Facebook or Twitter at Too Boldly Pod. And until next time, may you live long and prosper.
WLLP, Spock Rock Radio.